Many of the so-called experts claim that the refutation of the Danish Gambit is d takes c3, accepting the Gambit pawn, and after white's moved bishop c4, which accelerates white's development and hits f7, to take the second pawn, c takes b2. White has to recapture this pawn, bishop takes b2, and now his bishops are lurking on these beautiful diagonals. The bishop on c4 hits f7, and the bishop on b2 trains on the pawn on g7. The accepted move for black in this position is Schlechter's d5, which aims to give one of the pawns back in order for black to get his pieces out. White should take this pawn with his bishop, and then after knight f6, black intends to take off the bishop on d5, and he's also preparing to move his bishop away from f8 and castle kingside. I once overheard a really interesting conversation about this position between two Grandmaster aficionados of the Danish, Johnny Hector of Sweden and John Tisdall of Norway. Tisdall claimed that contrary to the view of the theoreticians, an endgame which white reaches after bishop takes f7 check is actually better for white. Hector, on the other hand, claimed that the simple developing move, knight c3, would leave white with excellent compensation for his pawn. He actually went on to show this in a game he played against Harry Schussler in Göteborg, Sweden, 1986. This game continued with bishop e7. Hector brought his queen out to the aggressive f3 square. Schussler played c6, driving this bishop away from d5. Hector brought it back to b3, and after the further moves castles, knight ge2, knight bd7, white built up tremendous pressure on black's position with rook d1, queen c7, h3, knight c5, bishop c2. In the subsequent play, white combined his kingside pawn majority, and in particular this pawn on e4, with the bishops on b2 and c2 to drive away the defenders from black's king and launch a very dangerous attack. After Schussler's bishop e7, Paul Carres once analysed another move for white, and that's queen b3. And he claimed that after castles, white could either play rook d1 or even castles queenside with a very strong initiative. Before moving on to Tisdall's preference, I'm going to mention a couple of really delicious traps into which the unwary black player is quite likely to fall. After knight takes d5, knight takes d5, black might be very tempted to try to drive this knight away from the d5 square with c6. But then there follows the shocking knight f6 check, after which gf is going to lose material to queen takes d8 check, king takes d8, and now bishop takes f6 check, picking up this rook on h8. If instead of capturing this knight on f6, black plays the move king e7, he goes out of the frying pan into the fire. White would answer this with bishop a3 check, after which king e6 is refuted by queen g4 check, king takes f6, e5 check, king takes e5 is forced, and now knight f3 check, king f6, queen g5 check leads to mate. If black doesn't drive this knight away from d5 and instead plays, say, knight c6, he doesn't lose on the spot, but he has a lot of trouble completing his development because of the strong position of this knight and the fact that this bishop on b2 bears down on the pawn on g7. White could play, for example, knight f3. After bishop g4, he could hit this bishop with h3. The bishop might drop back to h5, and now white could castle, and black still can't develop this bishop on f8 because of the pressure against g7. Black would really be forced to try and evacuate his king to the queen side, but after the moves queen d7, rook b1, castles queen side, queen b3, white has already set up veiled threats against this pawn on b7. White would have a very strong attack for his pawn. When John Tisdall has reached this position, he's preferred to go for the endgame, which occurs after bishop takes f7 check. Now black takes the bishop on f7, and after he loses his queen, queen takes d8, he then gets it back with bishop b4 check, simultaneously attacking white's king on e1 and the queen on d8 with his rook on h8. White has to go back with a queen, queen d2, and then we get the endgame, bishop takes d2 check, knight takes d2, which is quite a critical one for Danish Gambit theory. While analysing this position recently with international master Andrew Martin, we decided that white was actually threatening to play f4, after which knight gf3, followed by castles kingside, would bring white's pieces to squares which supported a further advance of these pawns on e4 and f4. For this reason, black should hit this e4 pawn immediately with a theoretically approved move rook e8, which forces white to defend the pawn either directly with f3 or indirectly with knight gf3, after which knight takes e4 can be met by knight e5 check, winning the exchange. My own preference is for the move knight gf3. If black then tries to activate his queenside pawn majority with c5, we see one of the dark sides of putting this rook on e8. An eventual e5 by white, say e5, knight d5, knight e4, threatens the rook on e8 when the knight comes to d6. I agree with John Tisdall's assessment that probably this endgame is actually better for white, contrary to the opinion of the books. It's actually rather a typical scenario for a gambiteer to consider himself worse just because the queens are exchanged, but in the light of modern positional play we know better. White's passed pawn on e4, supported by this pawn on f2, will be more dangerous than black's counterparts on c7 and b7. Instead of knight f6, black could also develop his bishop on f8, with bishop out to b4 check. White should meet this with knight c3, after which bishop takes c3 check, bishop takes c3, knight out to f6, should be met by queen f3, bringing the queen to the third rank. Black has now taken this bishop on d5, but then white can choose between going ed and also using an interesting suggestion of Paul Keres, who wanted to play rook d1, castles, and now capture this knight on d5 with the rook. Rook takes d5. White is putting together an impressive attacking force, and after queen e7, knight e2, he's ready to castle on the king side and then use the opposite colour bishops to enhance his attacking chances. The Bulgarian GM Nikolai Minev prefers the simple e takes d5, after which this pawn on d5 exerts a cramping influence over black's game. His analysis went on castles, and now knight e2, Black develops his knight to d7, and after white castles, he might consider further moves such as knight g3 and then bringing this knight into f5, again to build up against this g7 square.
This is Grandmaster Damian Lemos here for onlinechesslessons.net. First of all, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you would like to receive more free chess videos from us, you can just click the subscribe button below. I would also highly recommend signing up for my free mail course, the 10 Grandmaster Secrets to Dominate Chess. During this exclusive course from onlinechesslessons.net, I'll share with you my own Grandmaster shortcuts to effective attacking, defending and growth hacks to improving your chess without complicated books or memorization. So sign up by clicking the sidebar on the right, and I know you won't be disappointed. Once more, this is Damian for onlinechesslessons.net, and I'll see you in my videos. Thank you.